Hi, Glenys.
Hey, Aaron. What do you want to talk about today?
How much I hate diets.
Yeah, diets suck.
So what do you do instead of a diet?
Intuitive eating, health at every size.
So how many times have you had to explain intuitive eating and health at every size to someone?
Like 5,000 times. But that was just to my doctor.
Okay, so how many times have you explained it to someone and then they said, but diets are the only thing I know?
That's like every time. Can we pursue health without thinking about weight?
Yes, we can pursue health without thinking about weight.
That's pretty revolutionary, what you just said. But what if you just don't like yourself at the size that you're at?
I think we need to understand why, instead of just saying I need to change.
So what's the deal with body positivity?
Oh man, that's a long answer. I'm Aaron Flores.
And I'm Glenys Oyston. And we are
Dietitians Unplugged. All right, welcome back for another episode of Dietitians Unplugged. I'm working on my DJ voice. This is going to be a part of my sizzle reel. So watch out, Kiss FM. I'm coming for you. Ryan Seacrest, your days are numbered.
His days should be numbered.
Well,
I mean, not like
poor guy.
Not in a death way. Okay. God, that's sorry. Never mind. It's fine. Ryan Seacrest is fine.
You're good.
I find him a little annoying, but anyway.
No, here we are for another episode. How you doing, Glenys?
I'm doing okay.
Yeah.
I feel like fans of Ryan Seacrest are going to be coming for me now.
It's all right. There's like 6 of them. They're
okay.
Fine. We can handle it.
Yeah. So it's good to be back in the studio.
Absolutely.
Talking to experts.
Yes.
Yeah.
I feel like this is like the expert circuit. Like we're going to have a circuit of just brilliant people coming on our podcast and talking about some really cool things. And this episode is definitely fits within that. We have Dr. Anita Johnston on, who wrote a book called Eating in the Light of the Moon. And it's a book, I think, since I started working with eating disorders, like everyone has talked about at some point, like, oh, have you read this? Oh, have you read this book? Oh, Aaron, have you read Eating in the Light of the Moon? And I'll admit, I finally, just having her on gave me a great chance to finally like, oh yeah, no, I totally like dove in and read it.
Yeah, no, same here. It's like, I think I'd heard about it maybe a while back and didn't dive into it because it wasn't giving me direct knowledge about intuitive eating somehow. I don't know. I just was like, I don't know, I guess I'll get to that. But when I had my Facebook group last year, which is now closed, I no longer have a Facebook group for a variety of reasons. But when I first had the group and people are saying like, what books would you recommend to sort of deepen your work in this anti-diet body positivity field? And inevitably somebody would say Eating in the Light of the Moon was the first book that they found. And I thought, oh, okay, that comes up so often that I really should be reading this. Much like you, have you read it? Have you read it? Have you read it? I was like, yeah, no, I will. But finally, when we got a chance to have Anita Johnston on, we were both like, okay, it's time.
Yeah. Well, and I got to briefly tell the story of how we met. So it was BETA 2017 in Brooklyn. And it was the same day where I was, had spoken, and I was sitting during another session, and this woman sits next to me and says, oh, I really appreciated what you said this morning. And it was so great. I said, oh, thank you so much. And I really appreciate you saying that. And we didn't really say much after. And we roll around till lunch, and the same woman sits at the same table with me. And there were a couple other people, and she was finally facing me where I could actually read her name badge. And of course it's Dr. Anita Johnston. And so I had this, very lovely conversation with her without even knowing who she was. And I felt completely took my foot out of my mouth and was like, I had to apologize to her after. I said, like, I didn't realize who you were, like your book, blah, 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 blah. Anyways.
Yes.
That's how we met.
And she still agreed to come on our show.
And she still agreed to come on the show. That's how I recovered the friendship.
Yes.
Let me read her bio because it's quite, she's done a lot of amazing things. So I wanted to give her credit, of course. So Anita Johnston is a PhD psychologist, a certified eating disorder specialist, and the author of Eating in the Light of the Moon, which has been published in 6 languages. She is the co-creator of Light of the Moon Cafe, which offers online self-study courses and also an interactive women's support circle and course for eating in the light of the moon. We'll put links to where you can find that in our show notes. She's been working in the field of eating difficulties for over 35 years and is currently the clinical director of iPono Hawaii, which has a residential program on Maui and outpatient eating disorder programs in Honolulu and the Big Island of Hawaii. Dr. Johnston provides individual consultations online and conducts soul hunger workshops and professional trainings around the world using metaphor and storytelling, along with her training as a clinical psychologist to address the complex issues that underlie struggles with eating, weight, and body image. So it's an awesome conversation. You all are going to love it.
Yeah, and when I read the book, I was like, "Oh man, why did I take so long to read this?" Right? Kicking myself.
Absolutely.
But I guess we only have so much time.
Right. But before we get to the podcast episode and the interview, what do you want to talk about, Glenys?
Yeah, I just want to talk about my online course that's available now all the time. So I used to run it as groups last year, but now it's available anytime people want to take it, and they sort of take it. It's DIY, and you just go at your own. Well, you go sort of on a daily pace. It's called Dare to Eat as much as you want without guilt in total freedom, because that's what I want you to be able to do after this course. So I kind of created it with people who are like me with people who are sort of like the way I was in mind, and that was that I needed really concrete skills to practice. And to sort of learn my hunger and fullness, and to understand what I wanted to eat and why I was eating the way I was eating. And so that is sort of what I've done here. I've taken all the best tools that I use with clients in one-on-one sessions and sort of put them into this 5-week course where you get an email every day and a little activity to do. And it's pretty basic, but it's, I think, really powerful. So if you are struggling with, the way you see your weight, it's a struggle, and the way you see your eating is a struggle, and you really just want to get to that normal or peaceful way of eating, I think this course would be really good and useful for you. So you can go to my website, daretonotdiet.com, and I'll just put a link right to the program. But it's available all the time now. So check it out, see if it's for you. I put all the details on my my online course page. And I hope to see you kind of in class.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome. And for me, same old. I'm working here in my office and at Center for Discovery. I expanded my office a little bit. So now I got some swanky new, I got a waiting room. I got a little bigger space to see clients, plus a space for groups. So groups will be coming up soon. And I'm wrapping up my certification program to be a body trust provider, which has been amazing. And I will bring that into everything I do.
Yeah. So work with us.
Totally. All right. So that ends the plug portion.
Yes.
Let's resume. And here, without further ado, is our conversation with Dr. Anita Johnston.
Hi, Anita. Welcome to our show. We're so excited to have you here.
Aloha. I'm happy to chat with you.
Aloha. And you're in Hawaii, and we're so envious right now.
Yeah, we have Mai Tais here, just so you know.
Well, then there you are. Aloha is everywhere.
Exactly. Oh, believe me. I wear like Hawaiian shirts all the time.
That is true. You do.
So I'm super jealous that next time we're coming out and interviewing you in our remote studio in Hawaii.
Face to face.
Yeah.
Sounds great.
Under a palm tree. So we're as I said, we're so excited to have you here because your work is, it's just what everybody talks about. I ran a Facebook group last year, and people kept talking about what books would you recommend to read, and doing this anti-diet work and, disordered eating, healing from disordered eating. And everybody said, always, the first book I ever encountered was Eating in the Light of the Moon by Anita Johnston. And so it's amazing to have you here. So can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to write Eating in the Light of the Moon, and what brought you to this work?
Well, it's a long story, so I'm going to try to keep it short because I've been doing this for a long time already. But many years ago, I'm talking about the early 1980s, And I was working with lots of folks with all kinds of eating disorders and disordered eating and what I now call eating difficulties, because I think it's just a wide spectrum of all different kinds of struggles. And I had clients sitting across from me in my sessions asking me, where can I read more about what you're talking about? And I realized, I don't think it's been written. And I've never really considered myself a writer. So I thought, well, I'll do a little booklet for my clients. And that booklet just kept growing. It took me 10 years to write Eating in the Light of the Moon. I had a practice and I had children I was raising. And so I just designated one day a week to write about that. And then it grew into bringing in the folk tales and fairy tales, because that's what was working in my sessions. And so I would start to bring that in. And at the time, my children were going to Waldorf schools, and they would come home and they would say, oh, today we learned about Prince division and Prince multiplication. And I thought to myself, wow, if I had learned math in that way, I would probably know my times tables today. and I realized that this is a great way to teach some pretty difficult concepts in ways that make them understandable, at least to people like myself. And then I grew up in an indigenous culture with many different cultures on the island of Guam. And I had mothers that were Chamorro and Filipina and also American. And a lot of what we were taught was taught through storytelling. And so that's how I started to bring in the storytelling and the metaphors. And that's the short version.
It's so interesting because when I read your book, the metaphor, you're absolutely right. Those metaphors and stories bring like really difficult concepts into like really understandable terms. And I was when I read the book, I was just amazed at how many different types of metaphors and stories you found and like folk tales. And so I have two questions. One is, can you talk a little bit how you sort of cultivated that list of, or that database of stories? And two, one of my favorites is the metaphor that you have about the log.
Oh, everyone's favorite.
Is it really? Oh man.
Now it's mine.
Okay.
That's my favorite because everybody loves that one.
So I was hoping I was unique, but that's okay. So I was wondering if we could just talk a little bit about that log metaphor as well, because it is so interesting. So, but first I would love, like, how did you cultivate all these stories?
Again, I was raised with storytelling, so there was some familiarity in that. And then when my children were little, we had a long drive to school. And so I would make up stories to just entertain them. And of course, they were little, so they weren't very critical, which gave me free rein to just kind of play with storytelling. But then when I had written Eating the Light of the Moon, it was initially there were going to be poems in it from someone who had recovered herself. But my editor said, no, I want more stories. And I thought, oh, well, I had a few stories, but where am I going to find the stories that fit for these concepts? And so I would go to the library and in the children's section, and actually, literally, books would fall at my feet. And I would pick it up and go, oh, this is great. I can use this for that. And so then I began my hunt for stories. But truth be told, it's only if a story really resonates with me, if I can feel it quickening in my own body, then I go, okay, this is a teaching tale. Because some of the stories are really, really old, and they've lasted a long time through oral tradition. And then folks like the Brothers Grimm's started writing them down, and that's why we got Grimm's fairy tales. But they didn't make up those stories. They collected them from the storytellers, the ancient ones. And so I could feel in my body when there was a healing message or a teaching tale. So I would grab them and kind of wait until I found the message I was trying to convey. And then it just would seem like, oh, that story would fit. And with metaphors, most of the metaphors came, I think, from my experience as a child and even as an adult. Nature gives us the best metaphors. And because that's how we really do understand things. And that's how there's a familiarity And so what we know, and then I was involved in Jungian psychology, and Carl Jung was really interested. He called metaphors the healing symbol because they affect us on multiple levels, at the mental level, at the emotional level, and most importantly, at the imaginative level, because he said at the level of the imagination is where the transforming function exists. But what he said that I thought was so cool was he said, but all three of these things happen simultaneously, and that's what makes the connection to the psyche more immediate. So when I was in graduate school and I was studying Jung, I was fascinated by that. And so I started using them in my practice. I was also introduced to one of my very first classes in graduate school. I walked in and there's this little old man and he's speaking in a very thick accent. And I was trying my best to understand what he was saying. And that was Viktor Frankl. And he was a very well-known psychiatrist who wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning as a result of his experiences in the Nazi prison camps during World War II. And basically, his message was that we can have everything taken away from us, except there's one thing that can never be taken, and that is the meaning we give to our experience. And therein lies all the difference of our experience. And so that became a lot of the foundation for my work, is just trying to find the meaning. And metaphor was a gateway to that. And now the thing that's really cool, when I would use a metaphor with a client, I would see what I called the lights going off in their eyes when they would get it. They'd go, oh, got it. And now neuroscientists, they've hooked people up, for fMRIs and EEGs. And now that they see that when somebody gets an insight like that, there's a spot that we all have over our right ear in our cranium. And it's called the anterior superior temporal gyrus. And now what they can see is when somebody gets it, that part of the brain shoots out a blast of gamma waves, which is the highest electrical frequency in the brain. And new neural pathways are literally created. So I thought, okay, I'm staying the course here with metaphors. But really what kept me going was the feedback that I would get from my clients. And then after my book became more international, I started getting emails from around the world, people telling me that the log metaphor that you mentioned really transformed things for them. It really shifted things and really put them on the path towards healing. And I remember when I was sitting across from a woman in a session, and I was trying to get her to understand a whole bunch of things at the same time. And this is the other thing that a metaphor can do. It can deliver the layers of one message. And so I remember this metaphor just kind of coming out of my mouth as I was trying to explain things. And so, shall I share it now?
Yeah.
Okay, so with these metaphors, remember that Jung said that the transforming function is in the imaginative realm. So it begins with imagine. Imagine you're on the banks of a raging river. It's pouring down rain. You slip and you fall in and you're drowning. You're getting pulled down through the rapids. And along comes a big log and you grab on. And the log saves your life. It keeps you from getting pulled down and eventually carries you to a place in the river where the water is calm. And you can see the riverbanks where you're trying to get right over there. But ironically, you can't get there as you cling to the log. So the irony is the very thing that saved your life is now getting in the way of you going where you want to go in life. And so in this instance, the log is a metaphor for the disordered eating. There was a time that it kept you from drowning in some very strong emotional torrents, but now it's getting in the way of you going where you want to go in life. So I think what I'm introducing here, and I think it's really important, is to understand there is a function to whatever it is that someone is doing with eating and food, and maybe even an important function, and it would behoove that individual to find out what it is. Because, going back to our metaphor, to make things more complicated, there's always somebody on the riverbank yelling, let go of the log, let go of the log, right? And you feel like an absolute idiot because you can't let go of the log because maybe that person is the top eating disorder therapist or dietitian in the country, or maybe that person is someone who loves you and cares about you more than life itself. And here's where it gets interesting, because I believe that letting go of that log may not be the very best thing to do initially. Because what happens if you let go of the log because that person said let go, started to swim to shore, got halfway there, and realized, oh shoot, I don't have the strength and confidence to make it. That means I don't have the strength to make it back to the log. And now you're really sunk. So I believe we all have a wise part of ourselves that will not let us let go of anything until we're good and ready. So what do you do instead? Well, let go of the log, try floating. And when you start to sink, grab back on. Then you let go of the log and maybe you practice treading water. And when you get tired, you grab back on. And then you let go of the log and you swim around it once, twice, 10 times, 100 times, 200 times, whatever it takes for you to have the strength and confidence to make it to shore. Then you let go of the log. And so what I'm doing with this metaphor is I'm introducing the idea, first of all, there's a reason and maybe a good reason for doing what you're doing with food. And it would be good to find out what that is. Otherwise, you're not going to know what the skill set is you need to develop that's going to allow you to let go of it. And so, and I'm also taking away as best I can a lot of the shame, because so many people who struggle think there's something wrong with them, and they don't understand. Yeah, there's something wrong, but it's not with them. That they're caught up in a system, often within our culture, that is working against their very nature. And so, whatever there is they're doing with food has been a way to cope, but not the most effective way. Because they pay dearly for it. And so once they can develop these skills that will help them deal with whatever it is, their emotional sensitivity or their keen intuition or, work-related or family structures that, are affecting their self-esteem in some way. Once they learn that, then they can let go.
Yeah. So I'm going to, so I almost think like this is jazz, right? And the reason I say that is because we can riff on this metaphor in many different ways. And the riff I want to add to it is I think that as clinicians and especially as dietitians, we need to really understand this metaphor in our work. And what I mean by that is, someone might actually, and I know this sounds weird to say out loud, but someone still might need their eating disorder and I can't take it away from them, but I can't have them do work that they're not safe to do yet. And I think for me as working in the room with folks, that is incredibly meaningful in my work. So thank you for that metaphor, because I think it not only helps clients, but you're helping a lot of clinicians also in our work.
Well, I think the thing is that anybody can use metaphor. You see, you can be a therapist, you can be a dietitian, you can be a friend. Metaphor is simply a way of communicating about things that bring clarity to the situation.
Yeah, and I think it's so obvious now. We learn through stories more than anything. You can, hammer somebody with facts and figures, and all the science and all the solid science that there is, but the reality is that we tell stories, and that's why we watch TV. That's why we watch movies, and we do learn sort of about the human condition that way. And I think we learn about ourselves that way. And I love that log metaphor as well. And one of the hardest things I think for my clients has been to accept that, they start working with me, especially with binge eating disorder, and they want whatever they're doing, they want it to fix the behavior right away. And I said, maybe we need to practice some acceptance that this behavior is saving you right now in some way. And I think I'm going to be telling this log story a lot in the future. So I'm so happy that, I have this book of stories. And of course, I always recommend books to clients. So, but if they're not ready to read, like, it's great to have stories to tell. Like Aaron said, this is so helpful to clinicians.
Yeah, it's helpful. It's helpful because we work actually in a paradox, so that eating disorders are not about food and they are about food. Body image struggles are not about the body and they are about the body. And so what happens is, we clinicians have to find some way to have sort of like one foot in each world, to one degree or another. So as therapists, we understand that, the food piece does have to be addressed. Thank goodness for you dietitians, and vice versa. And so, but yet it's sort of like that yin yang sign. There's a little of each in everything, in where there's the light dot in the dark and the dark dot in the light. And so that's why I would use metaphor, is that it helps me navigate in this betwixt and between. That is where the healing, I believe, occurs.
Yeah. One of the things that I loved about your book is that you're sort of talking about embracing the feminine and the masculine that exists in all of us. And I appreciate that so much, because I think we get so slotted into you're female, therefore you're feminine, you're male, therefore you're masculine. And I thought that this really made so much sense to me. And maybe you can talk a little bit more about that. And then we also sort of were wondering if there's a difference between how embracing those two things, works for men versus women who are struggling with eating disorders.
Yeah. So again, here's a paradox. And I use masculine and feminine. I use those terms because I come out of the Jungian tradition. And it's a little confusing because it sounds like we're talking about genders, but we're not. We're talking about archetypes, which are like gigantic metaphors that, according to Carl Jung, cross every culture and every time. So, for example, if I were to talk about the mother, if you could go back in time, you would find that concept, and if you could go into the future, you'd find the concept of mother. And if you went to any culture on the planet, you'd find the concept of mother. It's archetypal. And so in the Jungian tradition, they talk about the feminine and masculine archetypes. And the reason they use those terms is because they work a lot with dreams. And in dreams, the masculine energy, which it's an energetic constellation really, shows up in the form of males. And the feminine in our dreams shows up in the form of females. So it's a little tricky because, again, it's the paradox, because women are the embodiment of the feminine and men are the embodiment of the masculine. But then we have this fluidity, in terms of gender identity. And so, but when you can zoom out and go into the archetypal constellation, then we're more in the world of yin and yang, which is how they use it in the Asian traditions. And basically the feminine energy is that part of us, of all of us, regardless of what your gender or how you identify. It's the part of us that is, the feminine is the emotional, the intuitive, the relational, that is interested in the inner aspects of our being and the connectedness with all things. It's our instinctual side. So clearly everybody has that. And the masculine is more outer. It is more goal-oriented, achievement-oriented, logical, linear part of ourselves. And so, but we live in a culture because we've had a patriarchy, which, again, patriarchy is not about men. It's about a system that has kept the masculine energies dominant over the feminine, right? So we are raised to have our goals and achieve things and use our intellect and fill our bank with money and get letters after our name and all of that. And as a whole, we live in a culture that has discouraged being emotional, being too sensitive, has taught us not to pay attention to our instincts, when to eat, when to stop eating, when to move our bodies, when to rest, when to go to the bathroom, all of that, just work. And intuition is something that's laughed at, and relationships aren't valued as much. So what has happened for all of us because of this imbalance, we've internalized it. And the way I see it getting played out with disordered eating is that, as I mentioned, not paying attention to your instinctual self that is going to tell you when to eat and when to stop eating, and is going to indicate to you when it's time to move your body and when to rest, so that you don't get caught up in either exercise addiction or exercise resistance. And intuition, that freaks us out. So there are those that I noticed in my practice that the way they coped with this imbalance was through eating behaviors or thoughts about food or thoughts about their body. Because if the feminine is devalued and the feminine principle that is embodied in women is devalued, then there's this push for women to have bodies like men. And and I think for men, there's so little encouragement for the full spectrum of their emotional being that I think then gets played out with eating issues. I don't know if that's making any sense, but I'm trying to spell it out as I see it.
Yeah. No, I've again, this archetype and these metaphors, I think, are really important. Again, for me as a clinician, and bringing up sort of topics, how I sort of see them, especially about patriarchy. And what's interesting is some of the men that I talk with that are struggling with binge eating disorder, this is a much harder sort of topic for them to sort of wrap their head around on some level. And it
What
may
do
be,
you mean?
I mean, like sometimes, like when I'm saying, like I'm asking you to like think about like both sides of this coin, right? And I might not even say feminine and masculine, right? But like
Right.
I might say, like, I want you to like think about your intuition, right? What is your own body wisdom telling you versus what is like the straight line goal oriented part of your brain telling you. And it's, I think for a lot of my male clients, especially with binge eating disorder, they have never nurtured that part of their brain where they focus on their own wisdom.
Right.
And so it's just a new language sometimes trying to learn on some level, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And I love changing the language around it. Actually, that is how I started working with metaphor, is that I had to find language that made sense to whoever I was speaking with. So sometimes if I was working with somebody who was a computer geek, I would try to find a metaphor in computers or just because we're trying to communicate what may be foreign concepts to somebody. And so if you can find their language, I'm really particular about language that doesn't pathologize. Because that brings in all the judgment, and then everything shuts down. And you're not going to get anywhere with that.
Yeah.
But after all these years, I've been working in this field before there was a field. So that's been about 35 years. I've come to see that there's really, I don't believe in eating disorders any longer. And I know that sounds a little like blasphemy, but what I've come to see is that we're really dealing with patterns that show up in food. And that's the part that may be alarming to someone. But if you kind of zoom the lens out, you're going to see those patterns everywhere else. And when you can address the patterns through eating, you're actually helping to heal other areas in their life. For example, you mentioned the guy with binge eating. What I've seen with binge eating is there's a theme of scarcity everywhere, so that it's not just food they're binging on. There's this theme of not enough. Not just not enough food, not enough time, not enough money, not enough connection, not enough coffee. There's just I'm not enough. So just looking at that, where is there not enough in your life? And someone who struggles with food restriction, that restriction is everywhere. They restrict their emotional expression. They restrict intimate relationships. They restrict their sexuality. They're always putting themselves on restriction if they make a mistake. And then with the yo-yo dieting, the weight cycling, the binging and purging, what you find is this kind of taking in or taking on too much getting overwhelmed and then have to get rid of it. So it's not just with food, but it's also, with shopping, or with someone might meet and start a new relationship and fall madly in love immediately. And then as soon as there's a problem, it's like, I'm out of here. I can't handle this. Or they might take on a ton of classes and get so overwhelmed they have to drop out, or a bunch of projects and then just say, oh, I'm going back to bed. So you start looking at those patterns, and then you have a whole other language for talking about what's going on. That's interesting.
Yeah, I mean that just resonates with me so much that people, that how they behave with food is telling them, there's a story there about their lives, and sometimes the food masks what the real story is, and that's why I feel it's so useful to sort of delve into what did your eating history look like. And so often it's always, I was denied something. I was a chubby child and I was denied food by my mother. And sometimes food was for me, food was a stand-in for love, and connection. And it's just the stories, when I look back on my disordered eating past, I can look and see that every time there was some major disruption in my life, I restricted. And that was such a safe way for me to deal with that. And so when you start to talk to people about what is the story of how you're treating food, and what's what's underneath of that, and like you said, the light goes off for them. Their little
Ding, ding.
the thing over their right ear goes off, and it's so sort of gratifying to see them make that connection that in fact their life isn't about food, and that they don't have a food addiction. Because I have so many people come, and I'm sure Aaron does too, like, I'm addicted to food. That is the problem. I am, there's something wrong with me and I'm addicted to food. Which brings me sort of to something else that really clicked for me in your book, which was the process addiction versus substance addiction. And that was such a useful distinction. Can you talk a bit more about that?
Yeah, I think the bottom line problem is we live in a culture that is so literal, that doesn't appreciate the deeper meaning in things, for example, and then just focuses on the literal object or substance in front of them. Just like, you had mentioned, when you look back on your history, you can see where something was too much for you, and so you would restrict. And so now we're looking more metaphorically at what happened. And the same with most people. Actually, not most people, frankly, all of us. Okay. It's not like there's those weird people that struggle with food, and then there's us. I mean, we all do this to one degree or another. And it makes sense if you understand, for example, that for most of us, our very first experience of being in distress as an infant, we're going, what are we given, the breast or the bottle? So then that becomes connected with that feeling of being soothed and comforted. And so, but the problem is, if you're looking simply at the foods, and I can't eat, you name it, white foods or and just, it's like, wait a minute, what are we really talking about here? And again, this comes out of the Jungian tradition. Carl Jung was involved in the formation of AA, for example, and he that brought this spiritual tradition in, because he basically said in his conversations with, I don't know which one it was, Bill W. or one of them, but basically said someone who is addicted to alcohol is really thirsty for spirit, but they're reaching for the spirits in the bottle. And then Marion Woodman came along, and she said, she's a Jungian analyst out of Canada whose work I revere. And she said, well, with eating disorders, the addiction is to mother. And I look at it not as like it's not, she didn't mean our biological mother, but basically mothering as a verb, which means comforting and soothing. And so you again, when you move away from the literal experience, you start to see there is so much more. You get to see what it is that is driving the addictive or the compulsive behavior. And so someone can be, for example, an alcoholic and drink and drink and drink all she wants, as long as she's not drinking alcohol, right? She can be drinking orange juice or milk or water. It's the substance that can be addictive. Whereas with eating difficulties, it's a process, the process of eating, not the food itself. And so then again, that brings me to the patterns. And as you mentioned, you can look at the stories of your past. But also, I think this is where working with eating difficulties is really, really fun. And I find this is where the joy in the recovery process is, because it's not just the stories, but the food itself that will tell you what is going on in your life in the present that is needing your attention. And to do this, though, again, you have to use your inner vision, your insight, so that you're looking at things metaphorically. And so to do this, again, imagination. The metaphor that I use is imagine two tanks, tank A and tank B. Tank A is the tank you fill when you need physical nourishment. You fill it with food. This is what you guys teach is. And tank B is the tank that you fill when you need what I call soul nourishment, when you need emotional or spiritual nourishment. And you fill tank B with things like attention, affection, appreciation, meditation, prayer, and so on. But most of us, because of this literal world we live in, we think there's just one tank. So before we know it, tank A is full and overflowing, but we're still hungry. Or we don't even want to get close to tank A because it seems like the bottomless pit. So what has to happen is you have to tease the two tanks apart by doing what dietitians do best, teaching proprioceptive or interoceptive awareness, developing intuitive eating, so that you learn your hunger and satiety signals very clearly, very specifically. And as you tease the two apart, then it becomes clear which tank needs to be filled. Tank A can only be filled with food. Tank B needs to be filled with other things. And so, even though I'm not a dietitian, when I started working in this field, there weren't any dietitians that understood intuitive eating and how to find those signals in your body. And so I'd bring someone through the process of that, because they had to be able to rule out physical hunger and satiety signals if they were trying to deal with these other hungers. And again, we live in a culture that doesn't tell us that there are lots of other hungers. And so and what would happen is, I would have clients who would get so excited, they'd come running in. I remember this woman came running into a session waving half a candy bar. And I said, what's that? She goes, well, I was eating it and I got halfway through and I felt my fullness signal. So I wrapped it back up and put it in my purse to eat again when I was hungry. And it was like, she was so excited. And it's really kind of fun when you discover that your body talks to you and that you can listen. But then typically I would have the client who would come in and say, well, I was reaching for the pizza and I know my hunger and fullness signals now, not a hunger signal in sight. And I went, oh yeah, you just tumbled down Alice in Wonderland's rabbit hole, landed smack dab in tank B. Now, tank B is the world of metaphor. And when you're in tank B, pizza is no longer pizza. Food is no longer food. What is it? It's a concrete physical symbol of another kind of hunger that you are experiencing and probably don't even know about, because it's unconscious. And Jung said the unconscious really is unconscious, right? It's out of our awareness. So now what do you do? Well, again, there's a skill set involved. Anyone can learn this. But the first thing you do is you ask yourself, okay, what's the feeling I'm trying not to feel? Because typically there's a connection there. And so you do a scan of your day, and maybe you're ticked off about the jerk that cut you off on the freeway, or maybe you're annoyed at something your boss said, or concerned about an upcoming parent-teacher meeting, or frustrated with your husband or whatever. But typically what happens to people when they do this scan, they go, I don't know. I feel fine. Everything's okay, right? And so here's the good news. The food itself will tell you what it is. The food is talking to you, but it's talking to you in metaphor. And it's coded. and you got to crack the code. It's not like, the kind of English we're speaking right now. But it's definitely a communication from a bigger, larger, deeper part of yourself that is trying to get your attention and knows you well enough to know that it's going to get your attention around food. But again, you got to translate. And so I'm going to give you the quick thumbnail sketch for doing this, understanding that everybody is different. But this is a place to get started in thinking metaphorically about what the food you're struggling with might be saying, whether you're wanting to restrict it or whether you're wanting to binge on it, or you're just simply craving it and obsessing about it. And for your listeners, if you don't have to scribble this down, you can just go to lightofthemoon.cafe.com/DU and download a handout for this. But it goes something like this. Sweet foods usually have to do with either feeling like there's not enough sweetness in your life or you're not sweet enough. Crunchy, salty foods are typically connected with unexpressed anger and frustration. Soups and stews usually are associated with maybe a craving or longing for emotional warmth. Spicy food with either a fear or a craving for excitement, stimulation, or change. And chocolate, come on, we're coming up on Valentine's Day. Sex and romance. And so once you can start to kind of look at the foods through that lens, something else comes into view. For example, I had a client and she was struggling with vanilla ice. She was struggling with bulimia. And so I said to her, okay, I want you to imagine a food that you would really love to eat as long as it had no consequences whatsoever. What would that food be? And she said, vanilla ice cream with strawberries on top. And I said, all right, I want you to imagine I've never had vanilla ice cream with strawberries on top, and you're going to tell me what's so wonderful about it. And she said, well, it's sweet, it's smooth, and it's refreshing. And when we took a look at what was going on in her life, her boyfriend was accusing her of not being sweet enough. She had hit a really rough patch with her parents that she was desperately wanting to smooth out. And she was in a dead-end job in need of a refreshing change. So there's one food and, all this other stuff to work on. And that's kind of how it works.
It sounds so awesome, because what I love is, again, it's like this notion of really zooming out and not getting fixated on, like the microscopic details of it, but to really zoom out and look at this whole picture of what's going on. Because I think that's when, we can really find what part of someone's life needs healing to help them move forward. So I really appreciate that perspective. So I was wondering if you could tell our listeners just a little bit about your Eating in the Light Cafe and what that is, and if they wanted to learn more, where would they go to learn more about that?
Okay, it's the Light of the Moon Cafe, and it started, I was working with, actually I do these Tending the Feminine Psyche week-long retreats for professionals with Carolyn Costin and Francie White, and we've been doing them for about 10 years or so. And a woman came and we teach in circle, and she said, oh my gosh, I really want to learn how to do this. And she was a dietitian in Virginia, Elizabeth Peterson. And I said, well, I can teach you how to do that. And so she started running Eating Light of Moon support groups. But then nobody wanted to leave, and she was running 5 groups, and she was an Anita, and I was flying all over the country doing what I still do, are soul hunger workshops, and I just couldn't be all the places I needed to be. And so she said to me, Anita, do you think we can create a women's circle online? And I went, whoa, I don't know, but let's try. So it took us a year of putting together the content, and we created the Light of the Moon Cafe, which is a platform for a number of different courses. There's a self-study one for those folks that just want to do something quick and easy and learn how to work with metaphor. It's called Cracking the Hunger Code. And then we created a series of moon modules, which I have one that's just starting this coming month called the New Crescent Moon, because it's the time of beginnings. And this one is an interactive course where women from all over the world join up for 8 weeks, and every single day they get something in their email box, whether it's oh, this week we're reading chapter 7 and eating in the light of the moon. Or the next day might be an audio of me telling a story. Or the next day might be a poem about that concept. Or the next day might be a metaphor that I give. And then we have a forum that we all talk about it. So I'm on that forum all the time. I respond to everyone, hopefully within 24 hours, unless I'm on an airplane somewhere. And then we have live calls where people can ask any questions they have. And so we do this, we immerse ourselves for 8 weeks. And I've been doing it now for 5 years, and it's been extraordinary. I'm just having the time of my life because these folks are amazing. It's really, really incredible. And then some of them continue through the whole series, and the transformation just is what I live for. It's incredible. So if anyone's interested, all they have to do is go to lightofthemooncafe.com. And if you're a professional, you can go to the professional page and sign up and get your individual professional code that you can pass on to your clients that will give them a discount of like $100.
Oh, that's amazing.
That's
okay.
great.
Aaron's writing it down like, okay, as soon as we get off, we're going to go and do that.
We really want to encourage, we have this online platform, but we really want to encourage people understanding there's help out there and to get the help that will support them in their recovery process. So we really like to promote all you folks out there.
Awesome. Well, we will definitely put links to that in our show notes and promote it so people can get these resources. They're great. Well, I just wanted to thank you for coming on and spending the time with us and sharing so many of these insights with us. They're really, I think, important for our listeners, but also for in the work that Glenys and I do. So this is like our own little learning session. So thank you so much for the work you're doing.
Really my pleasure. I just love what you folks are doing, and I'm happy to collaborate in any way.
Awesome. Well, mahalo and aloha.
Mahalo and aloha to you too.
Thank you for listening. This has been another Dietitians Unplugged production. You can find Aaron at bvmrd.com, and you can find Glenys at daretonotdiet.com.